So this machine that I've got here at the moment is just a standard Windows server that I've built in AWS. We don't currently have a Netskope client on it. We're going to put one on though, but first we're going to log into the Netskope tenant. So the Netskope tenant itself is a cloud tenant, so all of your traffic is being inspected in the cloud. You don't have to have on-premise security devices that your traffic is going through. People don't have to VPN back onto your estate in order to get any kind of protection. It's all done via cloud tenant, and you manage it through the cloud as well. Now I will just log into this. There we go. So this is us into the Netskope cloud tenant. This is the front end of it. So this is where you'll be configuring all your policies and so on. And down here under settings, this is where we configure the back end. So this is where we do advanced configurations and changes to the tenant itself. Under Security Cloud Platform here, we have users. Now Netskope licenses its product by the number of users for its secure web gateway and CASB and so on. You can see that I've got a bunch of users here with @workshop.somerford.co, and I've also got some users that end in somerford.demo. I could go around and manually create users. You need to have at least an email address for a user for it to work. I can upload a CSV, or I could just paste in here a whole bunch of comma separated emails in order to add users. But when you do that, you're obviously having to do manual work, and you would have to come in here and remove them if there's any levers and so on. And you also have these clients getting installed onto machines, and a user might not necessarily always use the same machine, etc. If you were to use the manual process here to add a user, when they install the client, they would have to be sent a hard-coded link that assigns that client to that user. They wouldn't be able to switch. If you use any of the other methods, such as Active Directory, then we can allow users to switch on a machine because it would pick up who they're logged in as on that machine and then badge that traffic to the user, but they would still have to be in here to be licensed. Now, if we were using the old method, we have this little thing here, which is called the directory importer. That would be pushing our Active Directory information up into the cloud tenant, and that is why I've got users appearing here that are coming from AD. This user here is coming from Active Directory, but we don't want that. These days, Active Directory is getting more and more phased out when it comes to usage because of the use of cloud apps and so on. Because I use Netskope all the time and Okta and so on, I'm constantly getting adverts that are switch to a domainless office or start up your new business without any infrastructure at all. They seem to be really pushing it to new businesses and so on. So we would use something like Okta, which is like an IDAM tool. What we're going to be doing with it is we're going to be provisioning users, and those users can use the same account on multiple applications. Because if you imagine at the moment, these are actually Google users. So this is a demo Google account I've got. So say we're a company that uses Google Drive and Gmail, then we've got an infrastructure there for, and we've got Google Meet, say. We've got an infrastructure there for collaboration without us building any servers. And all of our users have got a Gmail account, essentially, or a Google email account. But then they have to sign up for other third-party apps. So say they have to sign up for Box, they have to sign up for Dropbox and so on. Then are they going to be using their Google account for that? Great, but what if they were to sign up for one of these apps and it wouldn't take the Google account? They had to maybe specify a new username and so on. Well, Okta would allow you to centralize that because you could probably configure all the apps to use the Google account, even for those that won't allow you to register with one, if you could integrate it with Okta. Because all it's really looking for when you log in via Okta is it's looking for that handshake to be successful, and it just passes over that handshake to the application and allows you to log in with whichever account is configured. So here, we've got these users here. We are now going to install the client. So say we have our new start and we want them to start using Netskope, and say they were an admin on their machine, or we push the client out to them like via Jamf since I'm on a Mac, or we pushed it out to them via some other software distribution on the Windows machine. I'm just going to click this link and you can see that the client is now downloaded. It's about 10 meg in size. It's quite quick. I have one I prepared earlier, which is sitting in this directory on my desktop in this Netskope files. I'm just going to very quickly, I'm not going to run it, but I'm just going to show you the equivalent of the software distribution that you can do in the Windows. So you can see here that I'm calling the MSI exec process. I'm installing the Netskope file or installer. I've got a token that's provided from the actual tenant. I have the address that the client is to communicate with. And I have this setting here, which is per user config, which means that if I log into this machine as user1 at somerford.demo, it will automatically pick up which user I am. So if I now log off and log in as user2, it will pick that up as well. So you get that multi-user mode. So it's good if you've got people at hot desk in an office, maybe in a call center and so on, that to allow your users to switch without you having to uninstall, reinstall the client constantly. I'll just close this and we'll come back to here. So I'm just going to install this client. It should only take a second to do so. And it's now asking me to enroll. So if I return to my tenant, you can see that my address here is somerford.eu.goscope.com. So I pop into the top box, Somerford, and then in the second box is eu.goscope.com, just to match exactly what my tenant URL is. Hit next. And now we're being sent to Okta. So it's asking me, well, who are you? Like, which of these users here that are coded? I can't get rid of the screen, I can't minimize it, but behind here you can see each of my users. And I've got this Netskope demo one at the bottom that I'm going to use. Have I written that right? And here we're asked for my password. Now, I have not enabled MFA for any of these test accounts because it becomes really annoying, the amount of little authenticator tokens that I have to have and so on to properly show it off. So these are only using password only. But when I logged into the tenant, you saw that I needed my Google Authenticator that I had to go and grab. You can add on different types of MFA. So when I log into Okta later, I will actually be using the Okta Verify MFA, whereas I'm using Google for the Netskope tenant, and I'm using no MFA for these users. It's fully granular that way that you can customize how you want your users to behave. So that's handy if you've got maybe third-party contractors and things like that that you need to add into this, and they have to use a particular MFA already. Then you can add that to Okta if it's supported, etc., and customize how they're going to log in. So I'll just pop in my password here, and you can see that that is me. This client is now enrolled, and I can close that window. It closed it automatically. The install is finished, and I now have a client on this machine. It changed color there from gray to this orange and blue, which means that it is now working. And if I go into it and check my config, I have all the usual information that I would expect to see here. That's the gateway I'm connecting to, which has that somerford.eu. It tells me what POP I'm connecting to, it tells me what gateway IP I'm going to, and here's my user details here, Netskope demo at workshop.somerford.co. And that is the user that I used to log in. So now, if I would say working at home, I've registered onto this machine. I've used a cloud account, essentially an Okta account coming from Google. So Google is supplying that account, and I am now fully protected with any of the policies. I don't think I've got any policies turned on at the moment. We don't need them for this demo. If I was to come into the real-time protection here, then down here, these grey ones are usually the ones that I use for the demo. So I would have threat protection enabled. I would have risky websites getting blocked, unacceptable use websites such as adult content get blocked. We do have other features in here like the reverse proxy, which uses Okta as well, which we are going to look at today. I've just not enabled it yet. it messes with the client and so on when I'm trying to do things, because the minute you turn the client off, this reverse proxy is essentially active, so I don't want it active yet. And that is it for you registering users and managing users inside of Netskope. We're using Okta for that verification. But now we need to look at Okta to see exactly what is going on under the hood of that. So I've got an Okta account here, and this one I'm using my real account for it. And you can see that I was able to get into that okay, but the minute that I try and elevate, so I'm trying to go into the back-end admin side of it to configure things, and now I'm getting asked for my MFA. So I don't need it initially for logging into Okta for getting to things, but I have configured it that I need to use this Okta Verify if I want to do anything at an elevated level. So it uses a different MFA. It's still the same principle. I get given a code. That code times out every 30 seconds or so. It's the same as Google Authenticator. It's just done in a different way. And that does into the back end. So if we come down to, where are my apps? Under applications here in Okta, you can see that I've got two essentially that we're using. There's the Google Workspace and there is the Netskope user enrollment. So if I was to go to Google and log into Google Drive and use that Netskope demo account, because I'm logged into Okta as my Paul Doggraham, so I can't log into that as the different user while I'm logged into here. But all that was going to happen there is it was going to ask me for Okta details in order for me to get into Google Drive if I used the Netskope demo account. And if I wanted to go to Gmail, any Google service, essentially, I'm going to use Okta, my Okta details to do so. But the Okta details are the same as the Google details, but it is still Okta handling the initial authentication for me to get in. Now, if we take a look at this application, we can see that I've got a user provisioned to it, which is the Netskope demo. The reason that we don't have the other users, when I showed you the users in Netskope, we had these Netskope 1, Netskope 2, Netskope 3, is they don't technically exist right now in Google, because there's no point they cost money every day that you've got a Google account sitting. So I only provision them when required, and then I'll get rid of them shortly after. So I've only got this one permanently provisioned, but you can see that that one is saying that it's assigned to the Google application, and I can provision any user I want in Google right now if I want to. So this is saying that any user that I create in Okta, I can pass that user through to Google. So instead of me going to Google and creating a user there, then going around other applications and so on and creating that user individually everywhere, then I can actually provision from Okta out to applications. And that's exactly what we've done with Netskope as well, which we'll go into in a moment. So if I wanted to, I could assign other groups and so on. I do have a group for Google. So we've got a group here. In fact, I've not assigned a group for it. I'm doing it under standard users. So let's go and take a look at Netskope instead. Netskope's got all the users in it. Even though they technically don't exist in Google, they still can't exist here. So you can see that I've got this big bunch of users, and I've got this group here, which is called Netskope users. So I can essentially just create a user on Okta, add them to the Netskope users group. That is going to go to my tenant, and it is going to create that user for me inside of my Netskope tenant. And if I assigned it to the Google app as well, it's going to go and it's going to create that user in the Google app. The only thing I need to be careful of is the Google account is definitely associated with this workshop.somerford.co. So any user, if I was to go in and create a Netskope 7 right now, I would just have to make sure that that workshop.somerford.co is there. Otherwise, Google will reject it. It won't like me creating one that hasn't got that right, we'll call it domain there. So as long as I've got that, I can add them to any app. So I've got the Google, I've got the Netskope. I just create them in here once, push them out to these applications. I'm only doing it from one place. Then when it comes to levers, I can do the same. I come in here and I remove them from Okta. So I can take the user out of that group, out of the Netskope group. Okta will go to Netskope and it will remove the user from my tenant as well. So you're doing it all from this central location. And I could have about 100 apps in here that I'm assigning a user to, just pop them into a group, and they get automatically created. Then they get automatically deprovisioned once I remove them from that group. It works both ways. So if we were to go back to I should really sign right out of this. Let me sign right out so that we can now use that Netskope demo account inside of Google. I'll just close all these down. Hopefully they're all gone. I'll use this now. And that is at workshop.somerford.co. Remember, I'm not going to have MFA on this one. So that was Okta handling that. And I'm now logged into my Google Drive. Now, why is that important? You've seen that I've used MFA to log on to the Netskope Cloud tenant. And I was asked for MFA when elevating when I was going into the Okta admin console. I don't have MFA configured for this particular account, but let's pretend I do. MFA is extremely important these days because of phishing. So phishing, the most simplest thing that you can do. I mean, you don't even need to be any kind of level of coder or hacker or anything to phish someone. You're essentially just sending them, you find out a company uses a particular tool, which is very easy to work out. You go to Office 365 right now and bung in a fake name like joe.blogs at and put in a company if you know their domain there especially, then it will probably take you to a landing page for that company because all it's doing is checking the domain. I mean, I can do it with Google where if I was to sign out of this again, I go to log in. If this account did not exist in Google, this Netskope demo one, it would just say account not found. But when the account works, you can see that I'm taken to an Okta login screen. So therefore, if I was trying to work out what cloud services a company uses, I could just go round all the big ones like Office 365, like Google, and I could just start bunging in email addresses, even fake email addresses when it comes to Office 365. With Google, it is looking for the exact email address. With Office 365, it's only looking for the domain. And I would begin to quickly find out what that company uses. So now, using very little knowledge of coding a web page, I mean, I could just right click and save as the entire web page and do some tweaks to it for the login screen that they use. I just upload that to an AWS box, like a web server, and start sending that to employees that I've got the emails for. And you can buy lists of employee email addresses off of companies. You can go and you can get them. You can get lists of the domains used by employees by other companies. So under the guise of, therefore, marketing reasons, but you could just go and buy a whole list of email addresses or start phishing them directly on LinkedIn by contacting employees and so on. And then you send them that fake login page and start collecting their username and password if they fall for it. So if you've got a cloud-facing portal like this, then what is your protection? It is a web page that anyone in the world can visit, as long as they've got the right address. The landing page for Office 365, as I say, will take you to the correct login page, as long as you've got the working domain of a company. And all you've got is a username and password between the user and the resources. So therefore, you want to have that extra protection of the MFA, because at least you've now got that little 30-second token that's always changing to put another barrier in the way of an attacker. Now, you can get more clever with it. You saw that I saw the Okta login screen. If I had MFA on that, I could code it to where the user would even see an MFA page, and then they input their details there as well. And now you've got both, but you would have to be quick. You would have to script it to get logged into that company resource, because that token is going to change every 30 seconds, usually with one of these Google Authenticator or Okta Verify, etc. So you've at least got that extra protection there. You have that extra protection if someone did fall for a phishing attack. Now I'm going to come back to my policies and I'm going to enable this reverse proxy. So what we've got is we have an access method here of reverse proxy. Reverse proxy means I no longer need a client for Netskope to protect my users and my traffic. For apps that are supported through Okta, I can enable protections. You can see here that for Google Drive and Upload, I am blocked from doing so if I'm going through the Netskope reverse proxy. And I'll just turn that particular policy on and I will save it. And now I'm just going to turn off these two so that they don't get in the way of it at all. And I'll apply those changes. So we've no other policies enabled except for this reverse proxy. And you can see here that I do have policies configured that are purely for the client as well, but we're only caring about the reverse proxy. So if I turn off my Netskope client now, essentially none of my traffic at the moment is protected in any way, shape or form. So there's nothing on this box apart from the out of the box Windows Defender that you get. And that would check a file if I download it with malware in it. There's nothing at all. There's no firewalls, anything like that on this machine. I'm going to completely sign out of my Google. And I will sign out of my Okta as well. I'm just going to close the browser as well, and then we'll just open up a new tab. So we come back to our Google. We're going to log into Google Drive. And I want to go in as the Netskope demo. So it looks exactly like Google Drive. You would never know that anything different is happening here, but there is. There's something different. If you look up here in the address bar, you can see that we now have this rproxy.goscope.com added to drive.google.com. So if we weren't going through the Netskope reverse proxy, we would only see the drive.google.com, but because we see this, we know we're coming through the reverse proxy. And I don't have a client running. This has all been done in the browser. So my traffic has essentially been hijacked right now is the simplest way of summarizing it. But if I try and upload, I'll close this notification thing. I want rid of that. Let's just try and upload this text file. And you can see that it's upload failure. It will not allow me to upload a document. So if we go back to our policy and find our reverse proxy, you can see that uploads are blocked. If I come back to Google Drive, I'm going to download this malware. Might not let me download this either. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But where is my download button? Do it on the file. And that allows it to download. And the Windows hasn't picked up that that's malware. Netskope would. But now we've got this WeTransfer cannot be uploaded, but I can download. And that is Netskope is enacting policies, even though I do not have a client running on my machine. So what happened? We went to log into Google Drive. We put in a working username. We were then taken to Okta. We authenticated through Okta, but Netskope is configured behind the scenes to trigger the reverse proxy for Google. So it then handed us over to Netskope instead of Google, and then Netskope handed us over to Google. So we've essentially, it's like picture it like a man in the middle attack. Our traffic is now going to Okta, to Netskope, then to Google. And because we've got that little hop there, we can enact policies even if we do not have a client running on our machine. Now, why would you want to do that? Third-party contractors, you want them to have a level of protection. You give them a Google account inside of your company. but you don't want them to do X, Y, and Z. You want them to have the same control as your users who do have a client running on the machine, but they're not allowed to install a client on the machine because of their company policy. So that is, in essence, bring your own device. Forgetting personal devices for a moment, you're allowing a contractor to use their own machine to access your cloud services, but you can now enact policies on them to bolster your cloud protection, but they do not have to have a client installed. As long as they're logging in through that Okta mechanism, they will not be allowed to upload, download, whatever you want to put into that policy. That can be enacted even though they don't have a client. And the other side of that is the personal device aspect. So a quick scenario that I always bring up on these types of calls is I once worked for a company. It was a large IT company, one of the biggest in the world. I won't say who they are, but I was going abroad on the Friday. I logged off at 4 p.m., went to Manchester Airport. When I got to the airport, I realised I hadn't turned on my out of office and I hadn't sent a particular email. When I got to the country I was going to, where my brother lives, I used his laptop to log on to Office 365 with no MFA, so we only had a username and password. I logged on to Office 365, put on my out of office, I sent the email I was supposed to send, and I logged off. And nobody knew that I did that. So no one had any idea that I was A, in a foreign country, B, using a non-sanctioned device, so I wasn't using a company machine. You had no idea if that was me or not that was doing that. There was no protection in place, and there was no alerting or monitoring or anything like that. Now, that was before I did anything to do with cloud security, and I shouldn't have been doing it. I mean, it's wrong to be doing that, but nobody had any idea. But if you had this reverse proxy enabled and the Okta element set up, then when I logged in to that Office 365, I get asked for MFA. So therefore, that extra step is there to make sure that I am definitely who I am. Then, because I'm coming in from a machine that is not trusted, then maybe I couldn't have touched my email. Maybe I couldn't have downloaded files, etc. But I had full control over that cloud environment, even though you had, apart from my username and password being used, you had no idea who I was. Particularly coming in from a foreign country like that, nobody was any the wiser. So you've got those extra protections, even though you've no client, and you can start making specific rules. Because imagine that I got phished. So, that going back to that fake phishing page, I log in and I fall for it. So therefore, you've now got the user, well, the attacker is now logging in as me, but they're never going to be coming in from my device. So they're never going to be coming in from a machine with a Netskope client running on it that is hooked up to the cloud tenant. So they would be falling under the reverse proxy. And once they get in, they can't upload. Because one of the things they would probably want to do is move a file in that is ransomware and then start emailing everyone in the company to download and install it, to open up this ransomware executable. Because everyone's trained, don't click the dodgy links, don't download things that you don't trust. But because it's coming from a company resource and an employee, the users might trust it. And now you've got machines that are getting infected by ransomware, but you've stopped them from being able to upload a file. You've stopped them from being able to send emails from Gmail if they're not coming from a sanctioned device. So there's various reasons and layers as to why you would want this to happen. One of the main ones being bring your own device, makes it really easy for that. And the others is for that extra level of protection, particularly when it comes to phishing. So that is Okta and Netskope kind of talking to each other. And we'll just move into looking at Splunk. Now, because this is a test tenant, I don't have much to show in the Splunk side of things, but we can talk through it. It's because it's not used like an on-premise device. I don't have reams and reams of data to show. The other thing as well is the Splunk setup that I've got is very small, so I can't log absolutely everything because it's just a very small AWS machine that I'm using. It's not like an actual enterprise Splunk environment with like clustered indexes and so on. It's just a very small standalone device. So we'll start by going to Splunk base. When it comes to Splunk, in fact, actually, let's take a step back. Let's go and look at the visibility that you get in Netskope first to get an idea of why you would want to send this information out to Splunk. In Netskope, it's recording absolutely everything that I'm up to on my machine from a web side of things. So with this client running, the client is still off at the moment. I won't bother turning it back on, but it starts recording all of the applications that I'm using. So it sees me log into Google Drive, it records it. It sees me logging into Workspace, sees me logging into Okta. It saves this data. One of the most important things, because it's a cloud tenant, it saves this data for 90 days and then it disappears. You can pay Netskope to extend this time because the principles of cloud are you pay for storage, you pay for compute, you pay for web usage such as uploads and downloads and so on. So if I spin up an AWS machine, I'm getting billed on all those different levels of storage, compute, upload, download, etc. So if you wanted to extend your history in this, you would pay extra for it. But everyone, as standard, gets this 90 days turnaround time of activity being recorded. It's recording all of the sites that users will visit. So you can see I've got Google, Windows, Microsoft. If I do put that back to 90 days, you'll probably see way more, such as when I do my gambling demos and so on. I've got forum access when I block forums, iCar for threats and so on. And then we start to see all the information about users. So we can see exactly at granular level who are biggest users of the internet within the company. We can see all the applications individuals use, the websites they visit, how many times they're online, how much they've uploaded and downloaded, because that's a key one that many people just want to see where people are going, but you really want to be looking at who's hammering downloads. So if I go into Google and I was to suddenly download 1 terabyte of information, should I be? Why am I doing that? Am I leaving the company soon? And therefore I'm stealing all my business contacts and all my resources to put onto a personal drive to use in my next company. So it's always good to see exactly who is doing what when it comes to transferring information. Under events, we get application events. These are the actual what I'm doing in an application. So you can see today already I've used a reverse proxy. I was trying to upload files. That one is classed as an alert because we've got a policy for it, and that was a block. So that little orange mark there means that that is something that was called out that I shouldn't be doing. It's kept a note of it. It tells me the information about the file and so on. You can see that I downloaded the malware file, so that was allowed to be downloaded. I didn't have the threat protection policy turned on at that time, so it did allow the download. And we've got the client usage as well. You can see I'm logging into various things, but it's recording everything at a granular level of the activities I'm doing. A usual secure web gateway will only log that you visited a page, so it will only say that I went to williamhill.com. This will tell you if I went to it and logged into it, or if I downloaded something from it, or if I was to upload something to a particular site. It starts recording everything at an activity level because it can essentially read the internet. So it reads like the packets that you're sending, the JSON files. It can read all of that, and it records everything at a granular level of what someone's up to. Page events are when you visit websites. So this is me going to a website that is not an application. So if I went and created a website right now in AWS and just stood up an HTML page, it's not going to be an actual application. Netskope records applications, which we'll take a look at in a moment. This is just websites that I have visited. So it sees that I've went to Google Drive. It is an associated application. But then we have one here that doesn't have an actual application assigned to it. So let's see, can we see where I went? So it was a back-end Windows call, client.wns windows.com. The back-end Windows call has been made when I visited something, and therefore it's recorded that as well. Because it was web activity, it's kept a note of it. So you could see, like, maybe if I've got a bot running on this machine that is, tracking me in some way and sending information, you could see it in here. It would be capturing it as a page event. Network events are if you've got the Netskope private access. That's a whole other side to this. Netskope private access is where if you've got, say, an internal website, so you've got a payroll system that I have to go in and do a timesheet on, and the only way for me to get to it is via a VPN. I log on to the VPN, I can now access the payroll website because I'm on the company resource. Netskope allows you to do that, where you would put what's called a publisher inside your firewall, and that publisher can talk to your tenant, and that publisher can talk to the payroll website. So when my client is running, I have a connection to that payroll website because I'm going to connect to the tenant, tenant to publisher, publisher to payroll website. I don't need to be on a VPN. So it's essentially an always-on VPN. Think of it that way. You've got that connection to that single application. It also works with RDP and SSH. So if you've got an internal server you wanted to allow someone access to, instead of giving them VPN access and then the RDP, it would just be publisher can talk to that server on port 3389. So anytime I open up an RDP file and connect to that server, it takes me straight there. Because it takes me through the tenant, through the publisher, and to the device. I don't have to connect to a VPN. And I believe it's cheaper than VPNs as well. If I go to alerts, these are all the things that have been recorded based upon policy. So you saw that when I tried to download that file, upload that file, I wasn't allowed to upload. It recorded it as an alert to say I've tried to do something I'm not allowed to do, and it's kept a note of it. And from all of that information as well, if we come into our incident section here, it's also recording behavior analytics. Am I going to get any loaded? I've not been in this for a very long time, so no, we don't have any behavior analytics. But the behavior analytics are essentially, I mentioned before that I went to the foreign country and I logged on. Netskope would have flagged that as a distance factor because I logged on within the same 24-hour period. I logged on from the UK, and then I logged on from, it was Abu Dhabi that I went to. So therefore, it's going to flag that as hang on a minute here. Paul just went thousands and thousands of miles today. Is that correct? It would have flagged that here to say there's an issue, something's up. Particularly when it gets down to the speed of sound level, they call it, where if I had been hacked, say I'm logged onto my machine right now and I'm logged into Google Drive and someone's got my password and they log in as well, and they're in a foreign country, I can't be in two places at once. Sometimes I can trigger that as a false positive, such as I'm on this Windows machine here, and I've also got a Mac behind this that is in the UK, but this Windows machine will probably show up as Ireland. In fact, it's Azure that shows up as Ireland. So if I had an Azure machine and I was to access Google from it, it would class me as I'm in Ireland because that's where the actual server is that I'm logging into. But on my Mac, it's in the UK, and that would trigger a false positive here to say, but it would still call it out though, to say Paul seemed to have been able to go from the UK to Ireland in less than an hour, in less than 15 minutes, say. How is that possible? It would flag it up. But it also looks for things like if I went in and downloaded a terabyte of information from Google Drive, that's strange that I'm doing that. So it would call it out that I downloaded, say, 100 files or a lot of data. It would flag that too. It starts to capture things like shared credentials. So because the client is capturing all activity, it's recording the username that you're using. So when we looked at the application events earlier, there was a section on there called object, and in there it stores the account. So if I was to open up Google and I'm using my client, so the client knows that I'm on this machine, so it knows Paul's using it, but I then log into Google as a colleague, it would catch that and it would say, hang on a minute, it looks like Paul's account sharing. He just logged in as this other user. It starts to record things like that. So all of that information is getting computed using machine learning to give you that user behavior. And that's like the information that you're getting from Netskope. So all of those alerts and events, as well as things like this. Now it's also on this one, I've got the API enabled protection enabled. So it's looking at my Google Drive and it knows exactly what's going on in my Google Drive. So if I was to log in to Google from a machine that doesn't have a client and doesn't have the reverse proxy enabled, it would still be recording activity. Now this is always after the fact. So it's always, I upload the file, Google then tells Netskope that I uploaded the file. But you begin to see all of the activity in Google is now being recorded, no matter who's doing it and where they're doing it from, as long as you've got Netskope integrated with it. So there's reams and reams of information getting stored by Netskope. In Okta as well, I won't bother logging back into Okta, but there is a log section in Okta. where you can see, like, I authenticated, I changed a group, I did X, Y, and Z in Okta. I then use Okta to log into Google Drive, so therefore it's going to record that Paul logged into Google through Okta because I went through that, etc. So you're getting not as granular as Netskope is when it comes to all the applications and activities and so on, but you are getting some level of logging in Okta that is telling you what users were authenticating to, and if they got a password wrong, etc. It is recording that as well. But the issue is, we've got them all inside of their application. So if I want to see this information in Netskope, I have to log into Netskope to see it. If I want to see the information in Okta, I have to log into Okta to see it. I can set up various alerts and so on. When I configured that policy earlier, if we go back to our reverse proxy policy, I did have the option to set up email notifications here if that was triggered. Not the best way of working, getting emails constantly every time a policy's been breached. For some, you might want to have an email sent, but it's just, to me, it's not best practice to have hundreds and hundreds of emails getting sent. I can set up reports, so there's a whole report section in here. We have these advanced analytics where it can go into all the data and so on. I don't think I've got this enabled fully. Yeah, so I've got no real data collection set up there, but it allows you to do reports, allows you to go in and work out like what's going on with your machine. As I say, I don't really have anything set up on this. I'll change it to alerts anyway and see what loads. But again, it's inside of Netskope. So if you've got a SOC, are you going to give everyone a login to this Netskope cloud tenant? Same with Okta. You're going to have to give your SOC access to Okta as well to be able to go in and see these things. We've got it inside the Somerford at the moment where we get a false positive generated when we're sending email on behalf of someone else. We use a support mailbox, and it generates one of these alerts every time to say that, you know, it looks like Paul is account sharing because he just sent an email from the support mailbox. But we know we're account sharing because everyone uses the support mailbox to reply to people. So we get false positives like that. So I would have to be logging into Netskope every day to see those alerts and so on, or I would have to be bombarded with emails to get them because they're self-contained inside of their applications. So what we want to do is we want to send that information out to a central logging repository, which would be Splunk. Now, if we go to Splunk base, first of all, and we do a quick search for Netskope, we have an app and we have an add-on and we've got a SOAR plugin for Netskope. So for those that don't know Splunk, an add-on is a method through which it's easy to get data in. So you can essentially configure Splunk to get any data into it. I'll say any with a little star behind it, to get any data, as long as you know how to configure Splunk to receive that data and format that data and so on, then you could essentially put anything into Splunk, but you have to do it manually. You would have to go and work out how is the data sent from the application that you want to be ingesting from. Then you would have to configure it to be received. You would have to configure it to be parsed, etc. To various levels of skill there, depending on what you're doing. So some might be really straightforward, some might not be. But you have to know how to do it manually if you were doing it from scratch. You would have to have some kind of advanced insight into Splunk to be able to ingest something from scratch to get that data into your Splunk. But companies, and sometimes just complete third parties, individuals, might have already made an add-on that will do that for you, and it becomes really straightforward to get that data in. Usually it's just one little box you fill in with an IP, maybe a password if it's got to be authenticated in some way, or a token code or something like that. But that will get the data in for you, and the app will present that data. So once you've got your data in Splunk, you're probably going to be configuring reports, searches, you're going to be making dashboards, etc. Well, when you see that there's an app already available, it means that someone has probably done that before, and you can download it and you can install it. These are completely free from Splunk base, as long as you've got a login. So I would have to log into Splunk base to download these. And if we click on it, it gives you information about where it's supported, If I go down here, it's been built by this company here, Technology Integrations. And that seems to be some kind of, just looking at the address and the URL at the very bottom left here, some kind of Netskope Tech Alliance type thing. You can contact developers and questions on it, etc. It tells you what versions it is supported on, whether it's on premise or cloud or both. SIM is the common information model. So you've got all your things all using a standard for the naming of alerts and source types and so on. So that is supported from 4.x of the common information model. And it gives you some information on how to install it, etc., and what it's going to do for you, get release notes, etc. Okta only has an add-on. The last time I looked, it only had an add-on. So it's got a SOAR plugin, but that's for system orchestration and automation and response, I think is SOAR off the top of my head. But here we can see that we've only got an add-on for Okta. Now I've got the add-on installed, but I don't actually have it configured that well because it's such a small Splunk. I only really want to show off the Netskope side of it, not pulling information from both. So if we go to Splunk, we will now log into it. We've got 12 minutes left and we can have a quick look. So again, pretend this is Splunk Cloud. It's a public-facing URL. So therefore, we want to have our MFA on this. We could be using Okta to configure our users, etc., to be able to log into it. It's just a local instance. I'm just going to log in as this admin account. And that is us in here. I've already installed, you can see the Netskope add-on, the Netskope app, and the Okta are installed. I'm just going to quickly go to the add-on and show you just how easy it was to actually configure this to get the data in. So remember, our tenant is sitting in the cloud, so it's going to use our address, which is the somerford.eu.goscope.com. We're just pointing straight at our tenant. And if I edit this, you can see it just wanted a host name and it wanted to know what do I want to pull down from the actual tenant. So I'm pulling down all events and all alerts. There is an API token behind the scenes. So inside of my tenant, I won't show it off. There was a fake token earlier inside of that notepad file that we were using for the Active Directory. But here, the real token I would put into here. And all that's going to happen now is Splunk is going to go to this URL, use that API token, and start to get these events and alerts. So it was just two fields that I had to fill in to get that data to actually start coming in. There are other things we could put in, like if we're behind a proxy, what level of logging do we want? So maybe for support reasons, we would go to debug, and it would start to tell us like some really advanced information about our tenant and if it's running okay, etc. Don't want to be doing that because it's such a small instance of Splunk. I would end up with a million different events in here, and it would kill my Splunk. It would fill it up immediately. And then we've got the index that we want to point to. So inside of Splunk, you have an index is like your main collection of a particular type of log. So you might have an index called Windows, you might have an index called Unix. This one, we're putting all of these events into the index, essentially a database called Netskope inside of it. We do have some other inputs here that we can configure. We can bring in how often do we want to check these particular things. So I could completely delete clients. I don't want to see anything about clients if I want to, so I could get rid of that row. Or I could configure it that just every 24 hours we want to see it. I've set these every 3600 seconds. We want to see these events get pulled down, and they're all enabled. So as I say, I can turn them off if I want to. Search is just going to allow me to actually search that index. It's just a search app, just the same app that Splunk has. It's search and reporting app. It's just the same, but it's just going to be querying the actual Netskope index that I'm configured to. If we now jump over to the app, so that was the add-on. Remember, an add-on gets you data in. There's not really a lot to talk about it. I'm pointing at a source. I've given it an API token, and now it's going to go and collect these logs. But the app is where that data is now presented. So someone previously from that company that created this has went through and created all the dashboards that they think might help. So you can still create your own. You can still go in here and configure your own searches. There is a search option at the top here as well. And I could configure a big fancy search in this. and save it as a report or a dashboard, etc. But a number of them have already been done for me. So if I come back to my overview here, we saw these screens earlier. We saw them where we went into the application events, the alerts, etc. Pretty much all the same info, but you're getting it in this more visual sense rather than just a row. It was just row after row of events that we saw in the tenant. We could create a fancy report inside the Netskope to show it like this, but here it's done. So you could, if you configured this with some real real-time alerting, like say the user behavior one that we talked about earlier, where I was now in Abu Dhabi, and that was to trigger like a +1 on one of these or flag red somewhere, and you had that up on a screen inside of a SOC for that real-time monitoring, you could do that. And the other thing as well is because we decide how long things are kept for in our Splunk, so we configure what are called our buckets and so on, and the age of retention inside of an index, we can go well past the 90 days. So we don't need to pay any, well, we're going to pay someone, right? So if I need a bigger server, I'm obviously paying for infrastructure and so on for my Splunk environment, but you can now be saving, instead of paying Netskope to keep your information longer than 90 days, you could configure your Splunk to keep that information longer than 90 days once it's ingested. So if there was an audit reason you had to keep events for a year, push them out into Splunk and keep them in the Splunk for a year. Maybe in an age bucket, like an archive bucket, a cold bucket somewhere that you could bring that storage back whenever it was needed, etc. You could do all of that. And if we go through, we've got all of this information here that we saw inside of the tenant. But the fact is that it's going to be, it's not real time, remember. The policies are enacted on a machine in real time by the client if I was running it. So these logs are being downloaded every 3,600 seconds. So you might want to increase that if you wanted some kind of almost real time alerting on it. But you are going to have that faster response if you've got it coming into this. There is also the idea of an alert action. So inside of Okta, I'm just going to jump back into Okta. There is something that I can show you. And I logged into that as the Netskope, didn't I? So let me get rid of that Google Drive. And we'll come back into this as me. I only touched on it very loosely about the automation and the provisioning and deleting of users. So we're just going to take a look at that in a bit more depth just for a couple of minutes. We've got 6 minutes left. And it's my Okta verify. So this is a new thing in Okta, a relatively new thing that allows you to easily create workflows. So it will be very small on your screen at the moment, but it's essentially, I'll see if this video will work, whether that will show up okay. I won't bother playing the video, right? But I've played around with this to a certain extent, and it was really, I'm not a coder at all, so I don't sit and know what to do if I was coding some kind of script, but this does it all visually for you. So you're literally just dragging and dropping what are essentially like different processes in a full stack of provisioning, if you want to, where it could be sending emails to people if a user's created, or it could be doing X, Y, and Z, and you essentially just drag and drop and change these parameters, and you're essentially coding, but it's entirely visual. So if we went back to the Splunk, because you're getting the alerts into Splunk, you could be creating an alert action. That means that if a certain thing happens, so say for example, you think that I've been phished, so you suddenly see me logging in from a different country within 15 minutes of me logging into Google, something like that, and you have a definite idea that I've been phished, you could be triggering a Splunk alert action that would then trigger a process like this that would disable my account. It would lock my account. So therefore, you're not, it might be a false positive, you don't know, I could have logged in from a box like I said before about Azure, but you'd be better safe than sorry in that instance. So if one of these user behavior alerts was going to be triggered within Netskope, or someone started downloading 1 terabyte worth of files and they shouldn't be downloading 1 terabyte worth of files, etc., anything that was really suspicious is coming into Splunk now as an event. You're able to see that, and you could trigger a search. So it's constantly searching for that behavior. And then you've got that alert action. It's going to trigger, and it's going to trigger something like this. That will disable my account or lock my account or stop the download. It will do something to stop me from doing what I'm doing until you've verified that it was definitely me doing it. So when it comes to phishing, people don't always tell you that it's happened because A, they might not know that it's happened. All they'll see is maybe a 404 screen once they put in their username and password and maybe an MFA token if the phisher's that clever. They'll just see a 404. They won't go anywhere. So they'll close the browser, they'll reopen it. This time they'll probably go back to the proper company link and it will work. And they'll think it was just a glitch. Or they will know what's happened and they'll think they're going to get fired for it. So they won't tell anyone that they've been phished. And they'll maybe change their password and think that that's okay because the phisher won't have it. But the phisher actually scripted something to instantly do something the minute that they got hit. So it's too late already. Once they change that password, the file is already sitting in Google Drive. The emails have already been sent. But if you've got as close to real-time monitoring from those events being pulled down into Splunk, you could have those type of alert actions that would then trigger something like this that would lock the user's account. And that's Okta, Netskope, and Splunk all talking to each other. Various ways as to how they can be used. So we saw it, we can provision all our users for Netskope coming straight from Okta. We don't need to use Active Directory for it. All our users are coming from, say, Google, and then being pushed out to our Netskope tool via Okta. We're using that for authentication into our tenant, and we've got MFA enabled. You always want to be using MFA. If you're using any kind of public-facing web resource or application, definitely get that MFA on there, some kind of further check that a user is okay. We saw that we can configure the reverse proxy when we've got the Okta configured, so that if somebody does log into one of these things and they're not coming from a machine that has got a Netskope client installed on it, then we can be putting policies in place for that to give a kind of least privileged approach where we don't trust you, so therefore you're not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. Then we saw that we could be pushing that information from both Netskope and Okta out into Splunk, and then we're going to be able to retain it longer than 90 days without being charged by Netskope. We can use the add-on and app to easily get that data in and easily present it. The Okta, I never showed it, but the Okta add-on is pretty much the same when it comes to ease. You're literally just pointing at your Okta cloud tenant, and you have a token behind the scenes that you've created inside of that Okta tenant, and it's just reading that. It's pretty much the exact same thing. I'm pointing at the tenant. I've got the same options, proxy, logging, etc., what level I want to log it at. And it doesn't have a lot in it when it comes to, it does show you some information for stats. I don't have any information coming into it anyway at the moment. It does give you some dashboards, but not to the level of the Netskope one because it's a dedicated app. And you've got all that data coming in now from Okta and from Netskope that you can be triggering those alert actions or seeing things in as close to real time as possible as to what is actually happening in your estate. And it allows you to query it much better than if you were inside the tenant of Okta or Netskope. It allows you to query that information much better. Now that is us. So I haven't seen if there's any questions because my go-to meeting is always hidden when I'm in here. And I don't see any. So if there's no questions, you can contact us at info@somerfordassociates.com at any time if you want to know more about anything that was discussed during this webinar. And thank you for watching.